Hello, my name is Cade, and this is DSLRguide. Today's episode is about something that I hear a lot of people asking on YouTube, and it's all about how do we get the best image quality out of a DSLR for video. So there are a few main things that you can do. Most of them are pretty simple. It's just making sure you've got all these settings and other things right before, during, and after you're shooting. So the first thing to do, it's quite an obvious one. You most likely have already heard this, but it's very important, so it's worth saying again. The trick is to keep your ISO as low as possible, because ISO, the higher it is, the more grainy your footage will be. And no matter how sharp your lenses are, no matter how great your camera is, if the footage is really grainy, then it's not going to look good. This is probably the main thing that I've struggled with, is getting enough light in. So if you can have enough light so that you can keep your ISO below 800, below 400 even, then the footage will be really crisp. Because I think even at 800, ISO 800 on a 600D or any of the crop sensor cameras, then I think it is quite grainy. This shot here is shot at ISO 800, and I really don't like the way that it turns out. Whenever I go and shoot out in the sun, I'm always really surprised at how crisp it is, because shooting at ISO 100, 200, it just looks so much better. So next thing is picture style. Now Canon comes with a few. They have their own neutral picture style, but I recommend that you go and get the Technicolor CINESTYLE neutral picture style, which is free for all Canon cameras, and you can just download it from the website and install it. And what this does is really makes the most out of your the dynamic range on your camera. Now I think dynamic range is just as important as resolution and sharpness when it comes to video. Dynamic range is the difference between the darkest part of your image and the lightest part of your image. So for instance, if you go into a dark room with a window open, then if it's really sunny outside, then the window will just appear completely white. Whereas if the dynamic range is really high, then you'll be able to keep both things correctly exposed. Now DSLRs are pretty good at this compared to other cheaper video cameras, but things like the Blackmagic Cinema camera and the new Red Dragon has got a huge amount of dynamic range. So in order to make the most of it, the best thing to do is to use CINESTYLE. Now this is great if you're going to be color correcting, because it gives you the most control. If I use the standard Canon profile, then I always end up having to boost the shadows, because the shadows are often just really dark and you can't make out any detail. So it's much better to start off flat, and then you can add in contrast and saturation later, rather than letting the camera do it. It just lets you have full control, and I think it gives it a cleaner and more professional look. But it does take time to do the color correction, so it's kind of a two-step process. If you want to be quick and easy, then you can always just use the standard profile. So next thing is lens sharpness. Now all the pros will tell you that no camera is any good if you put rubbish glass in front of it. The sensor is only so powerful. If it has a really naff piece of glass, then it won't look good. But Canon glass and lenses in general can be very, very expensive, and sometimes the difference between cheap glass and expensive glass isn't that much. So lens sharpness is not such a big deal. Many people say that on the 1920 by 1080 resolution of video, you can't even see the difference in sharpness because it's just too minute. So when thinking about buying lenses, sharpness should come into account, but don't worry about it too much. For video on a DSLR, it's not such a big deal. However, if you're looking at vintage lenses or really, really old ones off eBay that require an adapter, then sharpness is going to be something that's worth looking into. For instance, FD lenses require an adapter with glass in it, and usually that glass isn't going to be very high quality, so it can degrade your image. The next thing is really easy, but it's also a surprisingly easy mistake to make. So this is just making sure that every shot is completely in focus. It's called tack sharp, and Canon has a nifty feature where you can zoom in 5 times or 10 times before recording, so you can just see how sharp it is, because often on the small screen you can't tell if you're completely in focus or not. Now, the trouble with lenses like my Tamron 17-50 is they don't have a very wide focus throw. It's only like 90 degrees, so you end up having to do these really small movements to get it in focus. The difference between in focus and out of focus is often not very much, especially if you're shooting with a wide aperture. So making sure that every shot is perfectly in focus is something that takes practice, and you need to have an eye for. But if you're doing an interview shot or something, or a setup like this, it's something that isn't that hard to get right, but if you do mess it up, it can really be quite frustrating. So once you've shot your footage, the next place where people can often make mistakes is in color correction. Now, a lot of people would say that you should increase the contrast and saturation to make it stand out more, and that you should use a technique called crushing the blacks, which is where you take the shadows and you reduce them so that it's got more contrast, essentially. Now, I think that the most important thing to think about when color correcting and grading is that you're keeping as much detail as possible. So in terms of highlights, this means just not increasing it so much that you're blowing out the highlights and losing detail, as you can see in the demo. And then same with the shadows, you just want to try and keep it as much detail as possible. So often what I'll do is I'll actually boost the shadows so that I have this really flat image but as much detail as possible, and then I will reduce the midtones to add some of that contrast. Now, I think this looks most cinematic and really makes use of your camera's dynamic range. And finally is sharpening in post. If you're using the Technicolor picture style, then it actually reduces the in-camera sharpening, which is a good thing, but it is important that you add it in afterwards. Now, the main thing to remember about post sharpening is to not overdo it. I usually, in Final Cut Pro, use either 2.5 or 3, depending on what the project is. But bear in mind, unless you've specifically removed the sharpening, then your camera will probably already have it, so you don't want to add any more. Okay, so those have been my tips for how to get the best image quality. Now, obviously these don't take into account anything like composition or lighting or the other things that are really important to make a good shot. These are things that just you can very simply and easily make sure you do every single time you shoot video, in a kind of formulaic way to know that you're getting the best shots. This doesn't guarantee that you might have good videos, of course. There are far more things to take into consideration, but these are just some ways to get started if you're not happy with your image quality.